Here's a final question
All right.
from Mr. Anonymous. He or she writes, I've heard God allows us to experience natural consequences of our sin. Can you speak to this in light of God killing David's son? That's an interesting way to put it, isn't it? God killing David's son. As a consequence for sleeping with Bathsheba, do we no longer live in fear of these types of consequences because of what Jesus did for us? You know, it almost sounds like a kind of a neo-Martianism, you know, of there's an Old Testament God and there's a New Testament God, which, by the way, is a heresy. I'm advocating it. That's a heresy. But the God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament, and I think that's a good question. Are there consequences to sin? And number one, number two, did God kill David's son? Number two, and number three, have we lost this fear of consequences?
Yeah. Let me say that I think it's really important to understand a term in the Old Testament that's kind of scary, and that is the wrath of God. How do we best understand the wrath of God? And I think really the best way to understand the wrath of God is God allowing us to experience the full effects of our own foolishness and stupidity and sin.
Yeah.
And he does that honestly out of mercy, because it's meant to wake us up, and it's meant to be an example so that we don't fall into worse self-destruction. Because that's what sin really is. Sin is so destructive, and it wounds us more than if we commit it, it wounds us the worst, even though we hurt a lot of other people.
John Paul II said it's spiritual suicide.
It's crazy. But anyway, the point I just want to make here is that the death of the son of David and Bathsheba is a consequence, certainly, of David's sin. But it's not like God killed the child. God allowed the child to die. Now, we happen to know that death isn't the worst thing that can happen to any of us. And so we would hope when a child dies, even an unbaptized child, that through the mercy of God, somehow they're in God's presence, in God's hands. But for David, you know, a child is a possession. It's one of the greatest gifts. Unfortunately, we don't think this way enough today. But in those days, a son is an arrow in your quiver, and it's a gift. And so, you know, this is not punishment to the child. You know, this is a consequence of David's sin. It's punishment to David, you know, for David. Now, I just say, for us, all of us need to understand there are consequences to sin in terms of the natural effects, destructive effects of sin in our lives. Yeah. And it's easy to see with something like alcoholism, you know, or drunkenness. Let me say, just when you drunkenness can lead to horrible things for us, physical illness and the disease. It can lead to horrible acts that we never would have committed when we were sober, that we hurt other people, you know. And so this is the temporal punishment due to sin means this in the Catholic tradition now. Jesus forgives the guilt of sin, but so we have to take responsibility to try to make right to some degree what we set wrong by our sin. So there's a need for prayer, fasting, and almsgiving for us to try to rebuild the good in us, and to the best we can to give restitution to others that we've stolen from. And we steal every time we sin, right? So here's my point. It's not like now saying yes to Jesus, please forgive me, all consequences are wiped out, all right?
Yeah.
So we need to do penance, and that's part of a difference in maybe understanding between some Christians. But for Catholic Christians and Orthodox Christians, we need to do penance. And we don't escape all the consequences temporally in this life of the stupid things that we do in sin.
Yeah, and penance is really, it's a rebuilding. It's a rebuilding of the good.
It's like you know, spiritual therapy. It's like physical therapy. You know, it hurts sometimes, but it's for our good. So prayer, fasting, almsgiving, spiritual exercise, it's kind of like therapy.
Yeah. Thank you for watching. If you would like to see more amazing content on the Bible, be sure to like and subscribe.